Wyoming, 1885. The wind tore through the Laramie Plains. Sharp with sagebrush and the weight of a fading summer, dust swirled in relentless eddies, stinging the eyes of anyone caught in its path. At the Laramie train station, where splintered boards groaned under years of boots and neglect, a woman stumbled off the evening train's last carriage. Clara Evans collapsed face first onto the cracked platform, her breath a shallow rasp, her body a canvas of bruises and desperation. Her dress hung torn at the hem, her boots scuffed beyond salvation, and her hands trembled with a fear that sank deeper than the grime on her skin. She hadn't eaten in 3 days, her lips split, one eye nearly swollen shut. The station master, a wiry man with a drooping mustache, froze mid-step. "Ma'am," he called, his voice thin against the howl of the wind. She didn't answer. Her knees buckled, and she crumpled like a marionette with its strings severed. A small crowd, freight haulers, drifters, a few curious townsfolk stared, their whispers swallowed by the gusts. No one moved. No one, except Cole Ramsey. Leaning against a fence rail, his hat tipped low, Cole was waiting for a delayed shipment of barbed wire for his cattle ranch west of town. His eyes, sharp as a hawk's, caught the moment she fell. In 2 long strides, he was at her side, dropping to his knees in the dust. His calloused hands slid under her back, lifting her as if she weighed no more than a sparrow caught in a storm. Her head slumped against his chest, her breath faint but stubborn, a flicker of life refusing to gut her out. "Where's the doc?" Cole barked, his voice cutting through the murmurs. The station master stammered, "Town's 3 miles off. Doc Harper's there." "I'll take her," Cole said, not waiting for permission. He carried her to his bay stallion, nestled her carefully in front of the saddle, and rode hard toward Laramie. Dust trailed behind them like a ghost, the horizon swallowing the last light of day. Clara's dress was soaked with sweat and grime, her wrists marked with bruises that told a story too heavy for words. She stirred once during the ride, flinching when his arm brushed too close. "Easy," Cole murmured, his voice low, steady as the rhythm of hoofbeats. "You're safe now." Her eyes, one barely open, flicked up to meet his for a fleeting moment before she sank back into unconsciousness, her body limp against him. By dusk, they reached Dr. Harper's clinic, a squat building with peeling paint and a creaking sign. That swung in the wind. The old doctor took one look at Clara and waved Cole inside, lay her on the cot. "I'll get what I need." Cole set her down gently, his fingers brushing a strand of matted hair from her cheek. He didn't leave. He stood by the door, arms crossed, jaw tight, watching as Harper worked with quiet efficiency, cleaning wounds, checking her pulse. Hours later, the doctor wiped his hands on a rag and said, "She'll live. Needs rest, food, time." Cole's eyes stayed on her, her chest rising and falling in shallow rhythm. "What happened to her?" "That's for her to say," Harper replied, shaking his head. Cole took a chair by her bedside and stayed through the night, his hat resting on his knee, his thoughts a tangle of questions he didn't voice. Something about the way she'd collapsed silent, like she'd carried the weight of hell itself and finally let it slip clawed at him. He didn't know why it mattered. Not yet, but he couldn't walk away. Morning broke over Laramie, the light spilling through the clinic's dusty windows, painting the room in soft golds. Clara blinked awake, her body stiff, her eyes darting to the door, then the window, calculating escape like a trapped animal. Cole sat beside her, holding a tin mug of steaming tea, its warmth curling into the cool air. "Morning," he said, his voice rough but kind, like gravel smoothed by a river. She tensed, her hands clutching the thin blanket, her gaze locking onto him with a wariness that made his chest tighten. "I'm not going to hurt you," he added, keeping his movements slow. "You fainted at the station. I brought you here." Her eyes flicked over him, searching for a lie, finding none. "My name's Cole Ramsey. I run a cattle outfit west of here." She swallowed, her throat dry, and rasped, Clara Evans." The name came out like a confession, barely above a whisper, but it carried a weight that made Cole pause. He leaned forward, offering the tea. "You hungry, Clara Evans?" Her eyes filled, a sheen of tears she didn't let fall, and she nodded. "Once, A small, fragile motion. He stood. Then let's get you fed. The days that followed were slow, deliberate, like the turning of seasons. Clara spoke little, her silence a shield forged from pain, but she allowed Cole near when others made her flinch. Dr. Harper, with his gruff bedside manner, kept his distance, sensing her unease. The women of Laramie whispered about the stranger, some with pity, others with suspicion, but Clara didn't care. She ate the broth Cole brought each morning, sipped coffee he brewed over the clinic stove, and let him sit quietly by her side. He didn't push, didn't ask, but his presence was as steady as the Wyoming mountains, unyielding and calm. One evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, casting long shadows over the plains, Clara sat on the clinic porch, her hands folded in her lap. Cole leaned against the railing, his hat low, watching the last light fade. She spoke, her voice barely above the wind. "Thank you." He looked over, his eyes catching hers. "You don't owe me anything." She stared at her hands, the bruises, fading but still visible, faint ghosts of violence. "I didn't think anyone would help me." The words hung between them, heavy with unspoken questions. He didn't ask what she'd run from, but the silence begged for it, a tension that hummed like a taut wire. On the 5th day, she broke. They were alone in the clinic, the fire crackling low, the air thick with the scent of pine and antiseptic. Clara's voice trembled, her eyes glassy as she stared at the floor. I had 2 children, Lily and Jack, 6 and 8. Their father. He took them, said I wasn't fit, said he had money, power, and I had nothing. Her fingers twisted the edge of her shawl, knuckles white. He beat me until I couldn't see straight, then told the court I was mad. I tried to take them and run. He found me. I barely made it to that train. Cole's fists clenched, the knuckles cracking, but his voice stayed calm, a low rumble. "Who is he?" "Henry Vaughn," she said, the name like poison on her tongue. "My husband was my husband." She shook her head, her voice cracking. "He's got friends in high places. They don't believe women like me." Cole leaned forward, his eyes steady, piercing through her fear. "Out. You're not alone anymore, Clara." She blinked fast, tears spilling down her cheeks, and looked away. "Why do you care?" He stood, walked to the window, and gazed out at the darkening plains, the stars just beginning to prick the sky. "Because I saw you drop at that station, like you'd carried hell itself and couldn't hold it any longer. No one should live like that." She was quiet for a long time, her breath steadying. Then, in a voice so soft it nearly broke, she said, "I don't want to hide anymore." "Then don't," he replied, turning to face her, his silhouette framed against the window. Her chin trembled, but her eyes held his. "What if he finds me?" Cole's jaw tightened, a muscle ticking in his cheek. Let him try. Weeks passed, and Clara moved into a small room above Martha's tailor shop. A narrow space with a creaking floor and a single window overlooking Laramie's dusty streets. She earned her keep by sweeping and mending, her hands steadying with each stitch. The townsfolk began to know her not as the broken woman from the station, but as Clara, who worked hard and smiled softly at children passing by. Cole came often, his visits as predictable as the sunrise. He brought small gifts: an apple from his orchard, a worn book of poetry, a carved wooden horse he left on her table without explanation. One afternoon he tripped over a stray cat in the alley behind the shop, his boots skidding in the dust. Clara laughed, a sound so rare it stopped him cold, his heart catching at the brightness in her eyes. "Ch, you're not as tough as you look," she teased, a grin tugging at her lips. "And you're tougher than you think," he shot back, his own smile rare and warm. She looked at him then, really looked, seeing the kindness etched in his weathered face, the way his eyes held hers without judgment, without demand. One evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in hues of fire and shadow, Clara stood. On the porch, the air thick with the scent of hay and dust. She turned to Cole, who leaned against the railing, his hands loose at his sides. "Why are you still here, Cole?" she asked, her voice soft but searching. He met her gaze, unflinching. "Because I want to be." She looked down at her hands, the faint scars barely visible now. You don't know me. He stepped closer, his fingers brushing hers, light as a whisper on the wind. She didn't pull away, and from that night on, he held her hand whenever she let him, their fingers entwining in the quiet moments. A silent promise growing between them. The high summer heat settled over Laramie like a heavy quilt, the air thick, with dust and the hum of cicadas. Clara took to walking the trails along the North Platte River in the early mornings, where cottonwoods whispered and the water ran slow over smooth stones. She carried a satchel with bread and cheese, finding peace in the solitude. The river's murmur a balm to her scarred heart. One morning, she found Cole crouched by the water, coaxing a splinter from his palm with a pocket knife, his hat pushed back, sweat beading on his brow. "You always this early?" she asked, a half-smile tugging at her lips, her shadow falling. Across him, "Only when the cattle don't need chasing," he said, glancing up, his eyes catching the light. She sat on a flat stone, watching him work, the river glinting behind him. "What do you think about out here?" He flicked the splinter into the water, watching the ripples spread. "What comes next?" She traced a line in the dirt with her boot, her hands folded in her lap. "I haven't let myself think that far." He stood brushing dust from his trousers and sat beside her, their shoulders close but not touching. "Then let me ask you plain, Clara. You still planning to keep running?" She didn't answer at first, her eyes fixed on the river's slow dance. "I don't want to, but I don't know what staying looks like. It could look like a job at the schoolhouse," he said. "They're short a teacher's aide. Miss Eliza heard about you. Says you've got away with folks." Clara blinked, surprised. "She doesn't know me." "She knows you've kept going," he said, his voice steady. "That's enough." She pulled her knees up, resting her chin on them, the weight of his words settling over her. "What if I can't get my children back?" "I don't have an answer for that," he admitted, his gaze soft but unflinching. "But I know you'll never stop trying." They sat in silence until the sun crested the ridge, its light spilling over the plains. When Clara stood, she looked down at him, her voice firm. "I'll talk to Miss Eliza." He nodded, a quiet pride in his eyes, and she walked back to town, her step lighter, her shoulders straighter than they'd been in months. Trouble found her that night. Clara was locking up the tailor shop, the air heavy with the scent of leather and thread, when boots scuffed in the alley. A man's voice, slurred with whiskey, cut through the dark like a blade. "Clara Vaughn, ain't it? Heard you was wanted back in Denver?" Her heart stopped, her hand freezing on the lock. She turned to see a grizzled stranger leaning against the wall, his eyes glinting with malice, a bottle dangling from his fingers. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice steady, despite the fear clawing her chest, her fingers tightening on the key. He stepped closer, reeking of liquor and menace. "Henry Vaughn's offering a pretty penny for you, says you stole something that don't belong to you." Before she could answer, Cole appeared from the shadows, his hand resting on the hilt of his knife, his presence a wall of quiet strength. "You're talking to the wrong woman," he said, his voice low, dangerous, like the rumble of a distant storm. "Walk away." The man sneered, swaying slightly, but the steel in Cole's eyes made him hesitate. He muttered a curse and stumbled back into the dark, the crowd outside the nearby saloon dispersing like smoke. Clara's hands shook as she bolted the door, her breath coming fast. "He knows I'm here," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Cole's jaw tightened, his hand still on his knife. "Won't touch you." The next morning, a letter waited under the shop's door, slipped there in the dead of night. No signature, just a single line scrawled in black ink. "You can't hide forever." Clara's face paled as she showed it to Cole, her fingers trembling. "He's coming for me." "Then we'll be ready," he said, his voice a promise carved in stone. Clara threw herself into her work at the schoolhouse, where the children were cautious at first, their eyes wide and curious. She knelt to their level, listened to their stories, tied their shoelaces with a gentleness that made them linger. One girl, a shy thing named Sarah, left a blue ribbon on Clara's chair, its edges frayed but soft. That evening, as Clara and Cole shelled peas outside the livery, the air thick with the scent of hay and horses, she held it up, her fingers tracing its length. "I used to braid Lily's hair with ribbons like this," she said, her voice soft, heavy with memory. Blue was her favorite. Cole handed her another pod, his movements slow, deliberate. "You'll braid her hair again." She cracked it open, the sound sharp in the quiet. "I wrote to the court in Denver," she said. "Used a false name. If Henry's watching, he won't know it's me." "You think they'll answer?" he asked, his eyes on her. "If I don't ask, they never will." She looked up at the stars, their light faint but steady. "I want a place for them, Cole. Somewhere they can run without looking over their shoulders." He leaned back, his gaze soft but unwavering. "There's a place like that, a cabin by the North Platte, old but sturdy, been empty since the owner." "Past, I've been thinking about it." She turned to him, her breath catching, the weight of his words sinking in. "Ow, why tell me now?" "Because I'm thinking about what comes next, too." The silence between them was warm, heavy with possibility, like the moment before a storm breaks. Clara folded the ribbon and tucked it into her pocket, her fingers lingering on its softness. The letter from Denver arrived a week later, its envelope heavy in Clara's hands as she stood outside the tailor shop, the noon sun beating down. Cole waited nearby, his hat low, his hands loose but ready. She tore it open, her eyes scanning the page, her lips pressing into a thin line. "They've agreed to hear my petition," she said, her voice steady but tight with resolve. "Have to appear in person. 2 weeks." Cole nodded, his eyes never leaving her. "Then we ride." They prepared quickly, their days a blur of purpose. Clara worked mornings at the schoolhouse, afternoons drafting letters to anyone who might vouch for her Miss Eliza, Dr. Harper, the livery owner who'd seen her grit. Cole mapped the route to Denver, a treacherous stretch through the Rockies, his pencil tracing lines over a worn map. The night before they left, the tailor shop was attacked. 3 men, faces masked, kicked in the back door, their voices rough as they shouted for the woman Vaughn wants. Clara hid in the attic, her heart pounding, her hand clutching the self-knife Cole had given her. Below, she heard boots scuffling, a crash, and Cole's voice, sharp and commanding, followed by the livery owner's shouts. The intruders fled, but not before one hissed, "Tell her Henry's coming!" Clara emerged, pale but resolute, her hands steady as she climbed down. "I'm not running," she said, her eyes meeting Cole's. He didn't argue, didn't need to. He saddled the horses at dawn, the air sharp with the promise of frost. The journey to Denver was grueling. The mountain passes narrow, the air thin and biting. On the second day, as they descended a rocky trail, hooves thundered behind them. For riders, armed and masked, cut them off, their rifles glinting in the sun. "Hand her over, Ramsey," one growled, his voice muffled but venomous. Cole drew, his revolver, his movements calm, deadly. "You'll have to kill me first." Clara's hand tightened on her reins, her eyes scanning the rocks for cover, her heart pounding, but her mind sharp. A shot rang out, grazing Cole's arm, blood blooming on his sleeve. He didn't flinch, firing back, dropping one rider with a single shot. He spurred his horse forward, shielding Clara, and they galloped through a narrow gap, the rocks closing in around them. The attackers' shouts faded as they lost them in the maze of boulders, the wind swallowing their curses. That night, by a low fire in a hidden ravine, Clara bandaged Cole's wound, her fingers trembling but sure. "You could have died," she whispered, her voice thick. "Didn't," he said, his eyes holding hers, steady as ever. "And you won't either." Denver was a sprawl of brick and noise, its streets choked with wagons, the clatter of rail cars a constant hum. Clara kept her hat low, her coat buttoned, as they checked into a boarding house near the warehouse district. The landlady, Mrs. Tate, a sharp-eyed woman with a no-nonsense air, gave them a room with 2 cots and a basin of clean water, asking no questions. Clara stood at the window, her hands clenched, the city's pulse pressing against her. "Courthouse is 4 blocks away," she said, her voice steady but tight. "We go at first light." "I'll wait outside," Cole said, leaning against the wall. She hesitated, her eyes flicking to him. "It's not that I don't want you there." "I know," he said, his voice soft but sure. "You've made up your mind." She gave a short laugh, sitting on the edge of the cot, her hands smoothing her skirt. I thought coming back here would break me, but I feel ready. You've already done the hardest part, he said, his eyes warm, living through it. That night, as Clara lay awake, a shadow moved outside the window, a flicker of movement that made her freeze. Her hand reached for the knife under her pillow, her breath shallow. Soft knock came at the door, and Cole was up in an instant, revolver drawn. It was Mrs. Tate, her face pale in the lantern light. There's a man downstairs asking for a Clara Vaughn. Big man, fancy suit. I told him no one by that name's here. Clara's breath caught, her fingers tightening on the knife. Henry Cole's eyes darkened, his grip on the revolver steady. Stay here. He slipped downstairs, his boots, silent on the creaking boards, but Henry was gone, leaving only a note pinned to the porch. You can't take what's mine? Clara's hands shook as she read it, but her voice was steel. Tomorrow I end this. Courthouse was a cold, imposing building, its steps worn smooth by years of boots and burdens. Clara climbed them alone, her riding skirt pressed neat, her hair pinned tight, her shoulders squared against the weight of her past. Inside, she faced a judge with a stern face and Henry Vaughn, his suit pristine, his smile venomous, a predator in silk. He called her unstable, a thief who'd abandoned her children, his voice smooth as oil. Clara presented her evidence letters. From Laramie, Dr. Harper's testimony of her injuries, Miss Eliza's affidavit of her character, her own steady voice recounting years of abuse, each word a brick in the wall she built against him. The judge listened, his pen scratching, his eyes narrowing. Henry's lawyer faltered, but Henry's gaze promised retribution, storm waiting to break. Outside, Cole waited on the steps, his hat low, his hand never far from his gun. When Clara emerged, her face was unreadable, her eyes bright with something fierce. They're reopening the petition, she said, her voice steady. I need to prove I can provide a home, income, stability. They want an affidavit from someone I live with. Cole met her eyes, unflinching. Then I'll write it. It'll tie your name to mine, she said, her voice soft, almost a warning. In writing. I don't care about names, he said, his voice firm. She looked down at the folded paper in her hand, her fingers tracing its edges. They'll send someone to verify it. I have a month, then we'd better get home, he said. And for the first time, she smiled, small. Fierce thing that lit her face like dawn. The ride back to Laramie was quieter. The tension of Denver fading with each mile, the Rockies giving way to the wide plains. Cole had been planning, though he hadn't told her. He'd bought a parcel of land by the North Platte, a weathered cabin with a sagging porch and a barn that leaned against the wind. The deed was in Clara's name, a secret he'd kept until they crested the ridge overlooking the valley, the river glinting like a ribbon of silver below. This it? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Her eyes wide as they took in the cabin nestled among cottonwoods. It's yours, he said, his voice steady. Deed signed. Roof needs work, but it's yours. Her hands tightened on the reins, her breath catching. Why? Because you can't build a life on borrowed ground, he said, his eyes soft but sure. She looked away, her eyes bright with unshed tears, then back at the cabin, its silhouette sturdy against the sky. I don't know how to repay this. You don't, he said, his voice gentle. You live in it. They've spent weeks making it theirs. Clara sanded the porch until her hands blistered, the wood smooth under her touch, while Cole patched. The roof had rebuilt the barn doors with fresh pine. Miss Eliza sent a small stove, its iron gleaming. Dr. Harper brought a quilt, its patches worn but warm. Each evening they sat on the steps, sharing coffee as the stars emerged, the air cool and sharp. Clara's hands no longer shook when she passed the cup back, her fingers brushing his. A quiet intimacy growing in the spaces between words. A letter arrived just before the first frost, its envelope heavy in Clara's hands as she stood under the cabin's eaves, the wind tugging at her shawl. Cole stepped down from a ladder, wiping sawdust from his palms, his eyes on her. Denver? He asked. She nodded, tearing it open, her eyes scanning the page. Her lips pressed into a hard line, then softened as she read. Her voice was steady, bright with hope. They're coming. Lily and Jack? A matron's bringing them next week. Cole smiled, a rare warmth spreading across his face. We'll ride to meet them. The train pulled into Laramie under a sky heavy with snow clouds, the air biting and sharp. Clara stood on the platform, her gloves crumpled in her fist, her heart pounding so loud she thought it might drown out the whistle. Cole stood beside her, a steady presence, his hand close but not touching. When the carriage door opened, a thin woman stepped down, guiding two children. Lily was smaller than Clara remembered, her hair cropped short, her dress patched at the hem. Jack clung to the matron's skirt, his eyes wide, uncertain, searching the crowd. Clara froze, her breath catching, then dropped to her knees as Lily's gaze found hers. "Ma," the girl cried, her voice breaking as she ran, her small body crashing into Clara's arms. Jack followed, stumbling into the embrace, his hands clutching her shawl. Clara held them, her shoulders shaking, her voice a litany of love. "I'm here. I'm here." Cole tipped his hat to the matron, who nodded and stepped back. Her work done. They rode home in a borrowed wagon, Lily curled against Clara's side, Jack asleep in her lap, his small hand tangled in her shawl. At the cabin, Cole carried Jack inside, laying him on a quilt by the stove. Clara showed Lily the room, the window where the light fell warmest, the shelf where she'd keep their things. That night, she tucked them into bed, kissing their foreheads, her hands steady, her heart full. On the porch, Cole waited, his eyes on the stars, his arms folded loosely. Clara stopped before him, the lantern light catching the lines of her face, softer now, stronger. "Ow. I don't know how to name what you've given me," she said, her voice thick. "Don't," he said, his voice low, warm. "Live it." She reached for his hand, her fingers curling around his, steady and sure. "I want you to stay, Cole. Not just for them, for me." His thumb brushed her cheek, a gentle touch that held the weight of a vow. "I was hoping you'd say that." She leaned in, her forehead resting against his, the moment stretching warm and sure, like breath held between two hearts. When she kissed him, it was soft, deliberate, a promise sealed in the quiet of the night. The wind carrying it across the plains, the first snow fell soft over the North Platte, blanketing the cabin in silence, the world hushed and still. Lily stood barefoot on the porch, watching the sunrise, a blue ribbon tied into her hair, its ends fluttering in the breeze. Clara wrapped her arms around her daughter, her chin resting on Lily's shoulder, the warmth of her small body grounding her. Inside, Cole stirred the fire, Jack dozing against his shoulder, the air thick with the scent of cedar and cornbread baking in the iron pot. Clara stepped inside, her eyes lingering on them, then turned to the door, looking out at the land that stretched wide before them, not borrowed, not promised, but theirs. She turned to Cole, her voice soft but sure. "You made it." He nodded, pulling her close, his arms steady around her. "And we'll keep making it." The river moved beneath its thin ice. The cottonwoods whispered, and the plains stretched endless under the dawn. Clara knew for the first time what it meant to be home, to be whole, to be loved without cost.